So I wanted to show you when I take this paper sample apart to give you a better idea of how all the pattern pieces go together. The brim comes off and front of the hat. So the top of the hat, and this is the back of the hat, and the front is attached like this, and the brim. I copied my patterns onto cardstock paper and made it look nicer a little bit. It's much easier to trace around the patterns this way when your paper has a little bit of thickness, and it actually saves me some time. If you're printing my patterns on a regular paper, you can trace them onto cardstock or poster board paper using tracing wheel like this, or you can just glue them onto another thicker paper. I'm using this oddly shaped leftover fabric, which I used to make a jacket for a friend. So it is a jacket weight 100% wool fabric. I already fused the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'm going to put the pattern, paying attention to the grain line here. And I'm going to give about 3/8 of an inch for seam allowance, so making sure I have enough room on the edges. Now I'm going to trace this. And I'm going to draw in the 3/8 marks. It doesn't matter if this happens in a seam allowance. I'm going to repeat this one more time because you need 2 pieces from the fabric for the brim. On the front pattern piece, it says cut on fold on one edge. If you put this edge on the fold and cut the fabric out, you get the whole piece. But instead of cutting on the fold, I like to cut on flat. So what I do is to trace one side and flip to trace the other side. I think I get more accurate measurement cutting on flat, so that's what I do. Same thing for the top pattern piece. This edge says cut on fold, and fold is usually on grain, so I made sure this is on grain, and I traced outline of the pattern and all the notches. Now before I flip it, I'm going to make sure I mark the center and the notch for the flip and this end of the line. Now I'm going to flip it and align the notch and the edges, and then I'm going to trace the outside on this side and add the seam allowances to cut out the piece. By the way, this piece is upside down to save the space. The important thing is to still cut it on the grain. I cut out 2 brim pieces and 1 front piece and 1 top piece, and all the pieces are interfaced with medium weight fusible interfacing and have 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowances. And the printable patterns are not going to have seam allowances added to them, so you can add any seam allowances you want to use. I recommend 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, or you can even use 1/2 an inch, but the wider seam allowances will be more difficult to sew because of these tight curves on them. So I recommend about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch seam allowances. Now I'm going to cut out lining pieces out of this fabric. This is light to medium cotton satin fabric using these front and top pieces. The first thing I'm going to do is to stay stitch from this notch to this notch, and same thing on this side too. I'm going to sew these darts. To attach the front of the hat to top of the hat, I'm going to clip into this curve, close to but not through the stay stitch here. Then I'm going to match these notches. From this side, my stitch looks fine, but from this side, the actual stitch is just a little bit outside of the stay stitch I did previously. So I'm gonna go over this curve one more time, looking at this side to make sure the actual stitch stays within the stay stitch. Next, I'm going to put two brim pieces together. They are both interfaced. I'm going to put them with right sides together, and I'm going to sew the outside edge. On these back darts, I'm going to cut this seam allowances closer to the tip so that I can iron the seam allowances open. I'm going to use this pressing ham, this red side for the wool. I'm going to hold it like this, and I'm going to iron like this to blend the dart tip to the top of the crown. And for this seam, I'm going to put all the seam allowances toward the top of the hat, and from this side, stitch through all the layers about 1/4 of an inch from the seam all the way around. Since I did the stitching here, I want to add the similar stitching on the brim too. But before I do that, this seam allowance feels a little bit too bulky. So I want to gradate the seam allowance. That means that I'm going to cut one of the seam allowances smidge shorter so that the edges don't line up. Once you do this, you have a better transition between the seam allowances and where there are no seam allowances. But I'm going to do this just a little bit so that both seam allowances can be caught in the stitching. I cut off just this much from one of the seam allowances. Now I'm going to flip the right side out, and I'm going to stitch along the edges. I sewed the lining pieces together in the same way as the hat, but I didn't iron the seam allowances open. I'm going to put the lining piece in the hat like so, lining up all the seams. But before I do anything else, I'm going to sew the center back of the lining and the center back of the hat together. I'm taking both of the seam allowances of the center back dart of the lining and one of the seam allowances of the center back dart of the hat. I'm going to line them up, and I'm going to whip stitch here by hand. This is not absolutely necessary, but this is going to help the lining to stay in place when you're wearing the hat. First, I'm going to start sewing from the center front to the edge of the brim. Now make sure both sides match, then sew from this edge to the center front. I made the sweatband with 1-inch wide grosgrain ribbon. I tried it on and made sure it's the circumference of the hat I want. And on the hat, I made chalk marks at 3/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'm going to align the edge of the sweatband with the marks I just made. This is going to be the center back, so I'm going to quickly mark the center front. So the wrong side of the ribbon to the right side of the hat. This is the center front of the band to the center front of the hat. And then this hat opening is about 24 inches. It's going to accommodate the head up to 24 inches, but I'm just going to ease the excess fabric into the band. I finished pinning, and most of the easing is happening in the back and not much in the front. Personally, I think easing will give the hat a really nice round shape, but if you're using more tightly woven fabric, you might not be able to ease in this much fabric. So in that case, you might want to take in more fabric at the darts to make it smaller, or you can shrink the pattern in the printing to make the hat smaller, or you can use flat elastic for the sweatband and stretch the elastic to fit the band, and the elastic will do the easing for you. Now I'm going to stitch the band to the hat, and I'm going to try to stitch very, very close to the edge of the band. Okay, so I sewed all the way from here to here, and I have this much left to sew. I think the fabric shifted as I was sewing, and I don't think I can ease in this much fabric into this little distance. So I'm going to release the stitching from here to here and redistribute the easing and try to make it look nice. In the beginning, I didn't ease as much. So I'm just gonna try to redo the back. So I took out the stitching from here to here, and right now it's just hand basted. Hand basting is just big stitches to keep the ribbon in place. I think it's going to work better than just pinning, and I can take out this basting thread after stitching it with my sewing machine. After that, there are only a couple things left to do, which is to stitch down the ribbon in a couple places to the lining to keep it inside the hat. Then I'm probably gonna add some snap buttons in the front. Then the hat is complete. And this is how the finished hat looks like on me. And I like the overall shape, but I don't like how shallow it feels in the back. So I went back to the pattern and made some changes and made this second version of this hat. This is the first version, and this is the second version. I know it looks almost exactly the same, but the brim is 1/4 of an inch longer and the crown is a little rounder. And the biggest difference is in the back, it's 1 inch deeper, so it feels very secure on my head. I am pretty happy with this second version. The printable pattern is going to be this second version, so the pattern pieces are going to look a little different from the video, but the sewing process is going to be exactly the same. And I really like how this one came out at the end, so I hope you enjoy sewing it too. Thank you so much for watching and happy sewing!